Picture this, July 14th, 2025, Bastille Day. The Champs-Élysées glitters with military pageantry. Fighter jets streak overhead, painting tricolor smoke across a perfect Parisian sky. Tourists snap photos of the Arc de Triomphe. Luxury boutiques on Avenue Montaigne sell $5,000 handbags to visiting Americans. The world still sees France as it always has, elegant, sophisticated, wealthy. But beneath the champagne bubbles and croissant-scented boulevards, something is breaking. In a Lyon apartment that same morning, Marie-Laurent opens her paycheck. She has a master's degree in engineering. She manages a team of 12. Her gross salary, €3,600 per month, about $3,900. After social charges, income tax, and mandatory deductions, she takes home €2,400, $12,600. Her studio apartment costs €1,200, $1,300. Her student loans another $325. After utilities and groceries, she has €400, roughly $430 left for the entire month. Marie's cleaning lady earns €1,400 per month on minimum wage, about $1,120. The gap between them? Barely €1,000, roughly $100. 5 years of university education bought Marie the equivalent of 2 restaurant dinners per week. This is not the France of your imagination. This is not the France of Louis XIV's Versailles, or Napoleon's Empire, or de Gaulle's grandeur. This is a nation where 15.4% of the population now lives in poverty, the highest rate in 30 years. Where 650,000 people fell below the poverty line in 2024 alone, where the wealthiest 20% earn 4.5 times more than the poorest 20%, a historic gap. France is going broke, quietly, politely, systematically. And here's what nobody wants to admit. France hasn't balanced its national budget since 1974. For 50 years, every French government, left-wing, right-wing, centrist, has spent more money than it collected. The national debt now stands at 113% of GDP. The European Union's rules say it should be under 60%. The croissants are still excellent. The wine still flows. But the economic foundation is crumbling like a 300-year-old chateau with termites in its beams. So how did the nation that gave the world the Enlightenment, human rights, and haute cuisine become an elegant museum slowly selling off its furniture to pay the electric bill? How did a nuclear-armed G7 economy transform into a demographic Ponzi scheme where young people flee by the thousands and the government borrows billions just to pay interest on old debts? To understand France's quiet economic collapse, we must examine the forces that trapped it, the decisions that sealed its fate, and the warning it provides to every other Western nation approaching the same cliff. Before we dive deeper, let me be clear about our perspective here. We're examining France's decline from a global economic lens, specifically through the eyes of nations watching the first domino of Western prosperity beginning to fall. This isn't just a French story, it's a preview of what happens when any wealthy democracy runs out of road. To understand how France arrived at this moment, we need to go back to 1981. François Mitterrand, France's first socialist president in the Fifth Republic, swept into power with a promise. France would build the world's most generous welfare state. No French citizen would fear unemployment, poverty, or old age. The state would be the ultimate protector. The model seemed brilliant. High taxes on companies and wealthy individuals would fund cradle-to-grave social protection. Health care would be virtually free. Unemployment benefits would be generous. Workers would retire at 60, later 62, with full pensions. The 35-hour work week would guarantee work-life balance. For 2 decades, this system worked, or appeared to. France maintained its position as Europe's second-largest economy. French companies like Airbus, Total, and LVMH dominated global markets. Paris remained the city of light, the center of European culture. But by the early 2000s, cracks appeared in the foundation. Manufacturing jobs vanished. Between 1985 and 2025, France's industrial base shrank from nearly 20% of GDP to barely 10%. Factories in Lyon, Lille, and Lorraine closed. Production moved to Poland, Vietnam, China. France decided it would become a post-industrial society focused on services, tourism, and luxury goods. Demographics turned hostile. In 1980, 4 French workers supported every retiree. By 2024, that ratio dropped to 1.7 workers per retiree. The pension system, designed for a young, growing population, faced collapse under the weight of an aging society. The government responded by borrowing, and borrowing, and borrowing. Meanwhile, globalization accelerated. The European Union expanded. The euro replaced the franc, eliminating France's ability to devalue its currency to boost competitiveness. German manufacturers surged ahead with flexible labor markets. British bankers dominated finance. Spain and Italy kept labor costs lower. France, with the highest tax burden in the developed world, struggled to compete. By 2024, France faced 3 simultaneous crises. First, a wage crisis. Over 17% of workers earned minimum wage, with millions more hovering just above it. The gap between minimum wage and median salary compressed to less than 550 euros, about $600 per month. Second, a debt crisis. National debt exceeded 3 trillion euros, approximately $3.2 trillion. Interest payments alone consumed more of the budget than education. Third, a demographic crisis. With 9.8 million people living below the poverty line and 665,000 falling into poverty in 2024 alone, the middle class was vanishing. 3 crises, 1 trapped nation, and a series of desperate decisions that would seal France's fate. The first trap closed in the early 2000s, though no one recognized it at the time. French policymakers faced a dilemma. Globalization was driving down wages worldwide. Chinese workers earned dollars per day. Eastern European workers in the newly expanded EU earned a fraction of French wages. How could France protect its workers from a global race to the bottom? The solution seemed obvious. Raise the minimum wage. In 2003, the government indexed the SMIC, France's minimum wage, to inflation plus economic growth. Every year, like clockwork, the minimum wage rose. In 2005, SMIC increased by 5%. In 2007, another 4%. By 2024, France had the second highest minimum wage in Europe at 11.52 euros per hour, approximately $12.50. Workers celebrated. Union leaders declared victory. Politicians from left and right competed to promise even higher increases. It looked like a triumph of social solidarity over brutal capitalism. But there was a problem. French companies didn't operate in a vacuum. They competed globally. When you mandated higher minimum wages, you didn't just raise the floor for workers. You raised the cost floor for every employer in France. Here's how the trap worked. Imagine you run a mid-sized company in Bordeaux, manufacturing automotive parts. You employ 200 workers. In 2000, you paid your entry-level workers 6.50 euros per hour, about $7. Your skilled workers earned 12 euros per hour, about $13. Your supervisors made 18 euros per hour, roughly $19.50. By 2024, the minimum wage hit 11.52 euros per hour, $12.50. Your entry-level workers now cost you nearly double, but your German and Polish competitors paid far less. To survive, you had 3 choices: automate, move production abroad, or compress everyone's wages toward the minimum. Most French companies chose option 3. They froze wages for skilled workers. They eliminated bonuses. They stopped giving raises. The result? By 2024, over 17% of French workers earned minimum wage, and millions more earned just 1 to 2 euros, about 1 to 2 above it. This phenomenon had a name: smicardization, the process of the entire wage structure collapsing toward the minimum wage. The psychological devastation was profound. Marie, our engineer from Lyon, studied 5 years for her master's degree. She managed complex projects. She worked 50-hour weeks despite the official 35-hour limit, and her take-home pay was barely $1,100 more per month than someone stocking shelves at Carrefour. Why work hard? Why innovate? Why take risks? The answer for thousands of young French professionals was simple. Don't. Or more precisely, leave France. Between 2010 and 2024, over 2.5 million French citizens emigrated. They went to London, Brussels, Montreal, Dubai, anywhere wages reflected skills rather than government mandates. France suffered the worst brain drain in the developed world. Engineers, doctors, entrepreneurs, software developers, the very people who could have built the next generation of French companies, vanished. I spoke with a French software engineer in Dubai last year. He told me something I'll never forget. In Paris, I earned 3,500 euros, about $3,800, and paid 40% in taxes. In Dubai, I earned $8,000 tax-free. I love France, but France doesn't love ambition. But here's what made the trap truly insidious. As skilled workers fled and companies struggled, tax revenues declined. The government, committed to its social protection model, faced a choice: cut benefits or raise taxes. They chose taxes. By 2024, France had the highest tax burden in the developed world. The government confiscated approximately 45–48% of GDP in taxes and social charges. If you earned 60,000 euros gross salary, about $65,000, your employer actually spent perhaps 80,000 euros, roughly $87,000, on your employment after adding mandatory employer contributions. You received perhaps 35,000 to 40,000 euros net, about $38,000, $43,000 after all deductions. Companies couldn't afford to hire, workers had no disposable income to spend, the economy stagnated. And the smicardization trap tightened further. While wages compressed, France made a second, even more catastrophic decision. It would abandon manufacturing for a post-industrial future. The architects of this transformation were a generation of French technocrats trained at ENA, the École Nationale d'Administration. They looked at economic models from the 1980s and saw a clear pattern. Developed nations transitioned from agriculture to industry to services. Manufacturing was dirty, low value, and vulnerable to Asian competition. The future belonged to knowledge work, luxury goods, tourism, finance, and consulting. France would become the museum of the world. Paris would host millions of tourists who would pay premium prices to experience French culture. French luxury brands, Louis Vuitton, Hermès, Chanel, would sell $5,000 handbags globally. French engineering would focus on high-value products like Airbus jets and nuclear reactors. The messy business of actually making things, textiles, electronics, machinery, could move to China. Between 1985 and 2024, this strategy proceeded with ruthless efficiency. France's manufacturing sector collapsed from roughly 20% of GDP to barely 10%. Textile factories in the north closed. Steel mills in Lorraine shut down. Electronics plants in the south relocated to Eastern Europe. Automotive parts suppliers moved to Poland and Morocco. The government actively encouraged this transformation. Why subsidize declining industries? Why fight globalization? Better to retrain factory workers as tour guides, retail clerks, and service workers. For Paris, the strategy delivered. The capital attracted 40 million tourists per year by 2024. Luxury goods sales soared. High-speed TGV trains showcased French engineering. France remained the world's #1 tourist destination. But there was a problem. Actually, there were 3 problems. First, you cannot build a superpower on waiters and tour guides. Service jobs pay less than manufacturing jobs. A textile worker in Lyon in 1985 earned a solid middle-class wage with benefits. A hotel clerk in Lyon in 2024 earned minimum wage with precarious contracts. When manufacturing left, it took the middle class with it. Second, deindustrialization devastated France's regions outside Paris. Drive 2 hours, about 125 miles, north of the Champs-Élysées, and you enter a different country. This is La France périphérique, peripheral France. Towns where the only businesses left are a supermarket and a gas station, where unemployment hits 15–20%, where life expectancy drops, where despair becomes a political force. I drove through Picardy in 2023. Empty storefronts, boarded windows. Young people sitting idle in town squares at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. One man told me, "Paris treats us like we don't exist. They took our factories and gave us food stamps." These forgotten regions fueled the rise of Marine Le Pen's national rally, the Yellow Vest protests, and the social rage that periodically erupts in French streets. When you see protesters burning toll booths or clashing with riot police, you're not watching random violence. You're watching the casualties of the museum economy fighting for survival. Third, and most ominously, France lost economic sovereignty. During the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, France made a horrifying discovery. It could no longer manufacture paracetamol, basic Tylenol. The country that pioneered vaccination under Pasteur, that built nuclear power plants and supersonic jets, had to beg India and China for painkillers. Masks, made in China. Ventilators, made in Germany. Antibiotics, made in India. France had become economically dependent on foreign production for basic necessities. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine and energy prices spiked, France discovered it couldn't increase industrial production to meet demand. It didn't have the factories anymore. But instead of reversing course, France doubled down. President Emmanuel Macron, elected in 2017, promised to make France more competitive by cutting taxes on corporations and the wealthy. He called it supply-side reform. His critics called it neoliberalism. The reforms failed spectacularly. Cutting corporate taxes didn't bring back factories. It just reduced government revenue, forcing deeper cuts to public services. Macron's attempt in 2023 to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64 triggered the largest strikes in decades. Garbage piled in Paris streets. Refineries shut down. The government survived, but barely. France remained trapped. It couldn't compete in manufacturing because of high labor costs. It couldn't cut labor costs because of social opposition. It couldn't boost productivity because companies refused to invest in an environment of political instability and high taxation. The museum economy looked beautiful from the outside, but museums don't generate wealth. They preserve the memory of wealth created elsewhere, long ago. By 2024, France faced its final reckoning, the demographic collapse. France's pension system, established in 1945, operated on a simple principle. Current workers pay for current retirees. When the system launched, demographics were favorable. Families had 3 or 4 children. Life expectancy was 65 years. 4 workers supported every retiree. The math worked. By 2024, the math was catastrophic. Fertility rates had dropped to 1.8 children per woman, below replacement level. Life expectancy had risen to 82 years. Millions of baby boomers were retiring. The ratio of workers to retirees had collapsed to 1.7 to 1. Here's what that meant in practice. Every working French person was supporting themselves, their children, and more than half of a retiree's pension. The pension system was bleeding money. By 2024, the deficit exceeded 15 billion euros, approximately $16 billion annually. Without reform, the system would collapse within a decade. President Macron proposed a modest reform in 2023, raise the retirement age from 62 to 64, just 2 years. Germany's retirement age was 67, Italy's was 67. The UK and US were similar. France's 62 was already the lowest in the developed world. The proposal triggered a revolution. Millions took to the streets. Unions called general strikes. Refineries shut down. Garbage piled high in Paris. Riot police fired tear gas at protesters. The country convulsed for weeks. Opposition parties from the far left to the far right united against Macron. The National Assembly nearly toppled his government. Macron survived only by invoking Article 49.3 of the French Constitution, forcing the reform through without a vote. But why such fury over 2 years? To the outside world, French protesters looked irrational, privileged, unwilling to face reality. The anger ran deeper than retirement age. French workers, especially in peripheral France, felt betrayed by a system that promised security but delivered precarity. They paid the highest taxes in Europe. They watched factories close. They saw wages stagnate. They endured unemployment. And now the government told them to work longer? The unspoken truth was darker. Young French workers understood the Ponzi scheme perfectly. They were paying into a system that would collapse before they retired. They were sacrificing their youth to fund generous retirements for a generation that had benefited from 30 glorious years of economic growth, full employment, and rising living standards. A generation that had voted repeatedly for unsustainable benefits and then left the bill for their children. A 28-year-old teacher in Toulouse told me, "My parents retired at 60 with full pensions. I'll work until 67, if the system even exists then, for half what they get, and they call us lazy." By 2024, France faced brutal arithmetic. The poverty rate had reached 15.4%, the highest in 30 years. Nearly 10 million French citizens lived below the poverty line. The gap between rich and poor had widened to its largest in 3 decades. Meanwhile, government debt exceeded 113% of GDP, approximately $3.2 trillion. Interest payments alone consumed more than the education budget. The European Central Bank, which had kept interest rates near zero for years, started raising rates to fight inflation. France's debt service costs exploded. Rating agencies warned of downgrades. Bond markets grew nervous. Investors began asking the forbidden question, could France, the second-largest economy in the European Union, default? The government had no good options. Cut benefits? Political suicide and mass strikes? Raise taxes? They were already the highest in the developed world. Increase immigration to improve demographics? Politically explosive in a country where the far right was surging. Print money? Impossible. The European Central Bank controlled the euro, not France. France was trapped in a trap of its own design. For 50 years, every government had chosen short-term popularity over long-term sustainability. They borrowed to avoid painful reforms. They promised benefits they couldn't afford. They protected dying industries instead of fostering new ones. They prioritized consumption over investment. And now the bill was due. The tragedy was that France had all the ingredients for success: world-class infrastructure, excellent universities, a highly educated workforce, nuclear energy independence, a seat on the UN Security Council, cultural influence that extended globally, agricultural abundance, a generous welfare state that, theoretically, should have freed citizens to take risks and innovate. But economics is not about potential. It's about incentives, trade-offs, and mathematics. And the mathematics said France was going broke. By early 2025, the consequences of France's economic choices crystallized into grim statistics. Poverty reached 15.4% of the population, with 665,000 people falling below the poverty line in 2024 alone, the largest single-year increase since records began in 1996. The wealth gap between the richest 20% and poorest 20% widened to 4.5 to 1, the highest in 30 years. Young people bore the brunt. French citizens aged 18-29 experienced poverty at twice the rate of older generations. Over 2.5 million educated French professionals had emigrated by 2024, seeking opportunities in London, Brussels, Dubai, anywhere that wages reflected merit rather than government mandates. The brain drain accelerated. Engineers, doctors, software developers, entrepreneurs, the very people France needed to build new industries, fled. The country that produced Pasteur, Curie, and Sartre was losing its intellectual capital. France's economic decline reverberated across Europe and beyond. The European Union, already weakened by Brexit and divisions over migration, faced its second-largest economy teetering on the edge. If France required a bailout, like Greece in 2010, it would dwarf previous crises. France's economy was 10 times the size of Greece's. Germany, Europe's traditional paymaster, made clear it would not bail out France's unsustainable welfare state. The Franco-German axis that had driven European integration for 70 years fractured. Politically, France's center collapsed. The traditional parties, socialists and republicans, became irrelevant. Elections became contests between the far-right National Rally and the far-left France Unbowed, with Emmanuel Macron's centrists barely surviving. Political instability became the norm. Militarily, France could no longer maintain its position as Europe's primary military power. Defense spending, already below NATO targets, faced cuts to fund pensions and debt service. France's nuclear arsenal and UN Security Council seat remained, but its ability to project power diminished. Culturally, the myth of French exceptionalism, the belief that France represented a superior model balancing capitalism and social solidarity, evaporated. The world still loved Paris, but it no longer envied France. France's economic collapse teaches a brutal lesson that echoes through history. You cannot maintain a 20th century standard of living with 19th century productivity and 21st century demographics. You cannot promise unlimited benefits with limited growth. You cannot tax your way to prosperity. You cannot borrow indefinitely. Mathematics eventually asserts itself, regardless of political will or cultural preference. France made choices that seemed compassionate and humane: protect workers, guarantee security, tax the rich, support the poor. Each individual decision made sense. The cumulative effect was catastrophic. The smicardisation trap destroyed incentives. The museum economy hollowed out the middle class. The demographic Ponzi scheme created intergenerational warfare. The tax burden crushed entrepreneurship. The debt bomb limited future options. France is not an anomaly. It is a preview. The United States faces similar demographics, with baby boomers retiring and Social Security facing insolvency by the 2030s. Britain suffered deindustrialization even earlier than France. Italy's debt exceeds France's. Spain's youth unemployment mirrors France's brain drain. Germany's workforce is aging rapidly. Every developed Western democracy confronts the same equation. Aging populations, generous social promises made when demographics were favorable, debt accumulated to avoid painful reforms, and global competition from younger, hungrier nations. France reached the breaking point first because it pushed the model furthest. It had the highest taxes, the most generous benefits, the earliest retirement age, the strongest labor protections. France is the canary in the coal mine, and the canary is gasping. The question now is whether other nations will heed the warning or follow France over the cliff, wrapped in flags and singing anthems, believing that national pride and cultural superiority can somehow override economic reality. History suggests pride is a poor substitute for solvency. This concludes the story of France's quiet economic collapse. It teaches us that good intentions without economic discipline lead to national decline, that protecting everyone from risk eventually protects no one from poverty, that borrowing from the future to pay for the present is not generosity. It's theft from your children. This pattern repeats whenever nations choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. France is not the first, and it will not be the last. This is the hidden history. Subscribe now to understand the economic forces reshaping our world, because when your own country faces these choices, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. Because when the history books are written, the question won't be whether you enjoyed the croissants. It will be whether you understood the bill.